Welcome to the LowCarbUSA podcast, where we seek to inspire you to help us build this community. I'm Doug Reynolds.
And this is Pam Devine.
Okay, so I have Dr. Gary Fettke back with me again. About a year ago or so, we did a talk on YouTube, which was all about your persecution. Well, we talked a bit about your recovery and going into putting your brain tumor into remission through learning about the low carbohydrate diet. And then we talked about your persecution because you were trying to take it to your patients and you were reported by a registered dietitian 3 times, exactly. So I kind of want to move on from that. And you were asked a question quite recently that I was very moved by your response. So I'm kind of going to put that question to you again now, and that is, where you go from here, and where do you see your work taking you, especially in this low carb arena?
I'm trying to remember if the last time we caught up I'd actually been cleared of all my charges or not.
No, you had not.
No, okay. Well,
that's kind of like, now you've been cleared, where do we go from here?
I was reported for giving inappropriate medical advice or nutritional advice, which was to reduce sugar and junk food for my patients in hospital. I mean, it sounds crazy, but that's what it came down to. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, the medical board found that it was inappropriate and I was unqualified to actually give advice on reducing sugar to patients. And that was it was a disaster for us, but it became a public or a social media debacle. And with another couple of years of asking for that to be rescinded, asking it to be reviewed, it was finally reviewed. And then when it was reviewed, it was thrown out in 2 weeks. And then they said, look, we're sorry. They haven't really said sorry for taking 5 years out of our lives and their family and all the work. So I had never stopped practicing medicine and surgery, so that's continued on. What's interesting is that my referral base has come back because for a long time people said, well, it couldn't have just been about the sugar. It must have been something else, but it was just about the sugar. So I'm back. I never stopped practicing, but I'm back and workload's increased once again. In the process of all of that is Belinda's work on finding out who was behind it and why it was behind it. It was never about the sugar. It was never about the science. It was always about the vested interests. And who has been wanting to silence this message of low carb, healthy, fat living, eating real food? Because the science is incontrovertible. It is, let's talk about the Krebs cycle. You can put carbohydrate, protein and logs, and carbohydrate, protein and fat into the mitochondria. The mitochondria turn that into acetyl-CoA and into ATP, and that's life. That's the energy of life. It can't be anything more or less than that. So, as Belinda's always said, it can't be about the science. What else is going on? And her work's really shown as to who has been guiding and who's been changing and manipulating the dietary guidelines of the world, not just of the US, but of Australia, New Zealand, the Western world, who's been influencing the World Health Organization, United Nations, and food policy. And then agricultural practices. It is, hugely dependent on what the official advice is. And as it's turned out, it's not been about the science, it's been about vested interest and particularly ideology. We have uncovered that the role of, in particular, the Seventh Day Adventist Church has been there right at the beginning of the food guidelines of the world. Leonard Cooper, who started the American Dietetics Association in 1917, was working for John Harvey Kellogg at the time. She was a protege. She was a Seventh-day Adventist and leading a vegetarian and probably by definition a vegan lifestyle, because the term veganism didn't actually come up until the 1940s. She was instrumental in starting the Dietetics Association, which became a model for all of the Western associations, British, Canadian, Australian, New Zealand, South African. She was also the writer of the dietetics textbooks and nursing textbooks for the next 30 to 40 years that travelled around the world and effectively influenced the entire origins of dietetics and ultimately the dietary guidelines of the world. And if you look at the dietary guidelines, they are now essentially cereal-based, anti-meat, anti-dairy, rapidly vegetarian, vegan. And they've evolved, and our work over the last few years has really shown how they've evolved from, a whole food, meat and dairy at the top of that guideline to now being sequestered, down to the bottom, and even now out to the side. I know my plate doesn't even have the word meat on it now; it just has the word protein, and that really lets drift in all these side issues, nut, legumes, and alternative meats. And so the Adventist Church have been promoting the Garden of Eden diet, the vegan diet, since their inception. They, by nature, are the cereal industry. They started 101 cereal companies were started in Battle Creek, Michigan, nearly 100 years ago, or a bit over, in late 1890s to 1910. They effectively own the cereal industry of the world. They also brought the soy industry to the US. So we started with soy from China, but they effectively now own the Western world soy industry. They were right there at the beginning of all the meat alternatives. John Harvey Kellogg was involved in developing nut meat analogues way back again around the 1890s. So we've got a religious group, small in number but very high in influence. They're the second biggest educator in the world, who effectively own or are involved in the soy industry, the cereal industry, the alternative meat industry, who have been writing the food guidelines for 100 years and have, through their activity, their right arm of the church is the medical evangelism, have involved themselves at the highest levels of food policy, and that involves people on the food guidelines of the current review board in the United States, Joan Sabat, who is on that board, hasn't really declared his conflict of interest, which is his ideological one, and that he's a vegan. So he last year acknowledged in an article that he was a lead author in a journal called Religion, everything that I've pretty well just said, that the Seventh Day Adventist Church has had its agenda to control and guide the nutrition guidelines for the world. And it may seem extreme, but that's been their agenda for 100 years. That's their purpose, to actually make people healthier by promoting the Garden of Vegan diet, which was originally just nuts, seeds, and fruits.
But as far as I understand it, they don't even deny it, right? It's not like they do this surreptitiously. They'll openly admit that that's their mandate.
This whole issue has been hidden in plain sight all the way through. Everything that Belinda's uncovered has been freely available. It's there. If you look back on the internet, it's there. It's all actually been acknowledged, and they're proud of it. And that's fine. We don't have any problems with a group of people to have an ideology and live by that. What our issue is that ideology, which is based on belief, not on science, not on biochemistry, is being forced upon us with our dietary guidelines. And that means the dietary guidelines are being fed to our children in the schools. It's been fed to our loved ones in hospitals and nursing homes. It's fed to the prison inmates and our defence forces. This is a massive amount of the community which is having a diet forced on them. It's having a diet forced on them which is based on ideology and not science. And that's our concern. Our second concern is that diet's not only being forced upon us by the dietary guidelines, is that the Adventist Church, by their arm of lifestyle medicine, has been involved now with the concept of exercise as medicine, based on food industry sponsorship, to become the medical curriculums for medical schools. So we've actually got two arms that have come together now, which are now influencing not only our dietary guidelines, but our educational system. And that's a big concern, because that's having too much of an influence on where it's all heading. It would be fine if that experiment of a low-fat, high-carb diet was working. But it's not. We're getting fatter and sicker. And then my recent talk, I again look at what we've done over the last 45 years, and we've got good US data, we've got some good world data. We've in fact adopted everything we were supposed to do. We've increased our cereal intake. We've decreased our dairy intake. We've increased our fruit and vegetable intake. We've increased our protein intake with nuts and legumes, and we've decreased our red meat consumption. We've done everything that the Garden of Eden diet has wanted from a dietary guidelines, but across the US, across the world, we've in fact gotten fatter and sicker with a whole cohort of metabolic diseases. It has been a total disaster. That experiment has now failed, and we've got to move on. But the trouble is, the pressures upon the next dietary guidelines review, the pressures upon medical schools and medical curriculums is now, we need to keep doubling down. We need to keep traveling further down this path. And it's a complete myth when people say the dietary guidelines don't work, because we've done what they were supposed to do and they have failed.
That's really amazing. But so I'm going to say thank you for being with us. And then I'm going to say that I think we probably have to do some more, because I think you stole Belinda's thunder.
Not completely. No, you can build on that. But
You've been listening to an episode of the LowCarbUSA podcast. You can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/LowCarbUSA.